Now we come to Matt's supervisor, which is, as I said, was unintended before, his thesis supervisor, even though he took his first seminar with Derek Gregory at the University of British Columbia 21 years ago. Derek and I both washed up at the University of British Columbia in the 80s sometime. I don't know the exact date of you. In the kitchens. But he's gone on to great things, and he is distinguished professor at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Study, which is, there is one in the humanities, or generally social sciences, and one in the sciences. And so he occupies a very significant position, as well as being a professor of geography. Many of you will know his books, such as Violent Geographies, Fear, Terror, and Political Violence, 2006, The Colonial Present, Afghanistan, Palestine, Iraq. He has 2 new books on the way, and I'm greatly looking forward to hear him speak.
Well, let me too thank the organisers for arranging such a wonderful occasion on such a bleak subject, and to thank all of you for coming. I should say at once that I feel a complete fraud. One of those new books that John mentioned is concerned with what I call later modern war. Its title is Drones and the Everywhere War, and for much of the last 5 or 6 years I've been exploring aerial violence. But it's really only over the last 2 months that I've come to wander the nuclear wastelands. So this is very much a first report, and I suspect it's also in some ways a remarkably amateur extended footnote to Joseph Masco's compelling thesis that the origins of the counter-terror state lie in the national security state. The reason it took me so long to turn to the question of nuclear war was that at first glance there seems to be no comparison at all. If we look at the delivery systems for nuclear weapons compared to the range of today's Predators and Reapers, if we look at the munitions that they deliver, if we look at their effects, they surely seem incommensurable. And I'm not alone in thinking that, although I'm not sure this is the company I would prefer to keep. Harold Coe, legal advisor to the State Department, commending the Obama administration's policy on targeted killing, often used to say to the human rights community, according to Daniel Kleidman, I would have preferred targeted killings to Hiroshima. But others have a more complicated view. So, for example, the editor of The New Yorker suggests that we're in the same position now with drones that we were with nuclear weapons in 1945. And he's talking specifically about the risk of proliferation. It's inevitable that other countries, including countries that are hardly American allies, will follow. Then what? And that claim has been developed most forcibly by Richard Falk, a brilliant scholar of international law, who insists that, in that respect at least, drones are more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Not surprisingly, there are continuities, not least in popular culture. So Ian referred earlier to the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and like him, I joined E.P. Thompson to march on the streets as part of the European campaign for nuclear disarmament. And many of you will know that there are similar, though I suspect rather more restricted, campaigns against drone attacks. But even in that top image, you can see the continuity. And it's encouraging to know that the spirit of CND lives on. And certainly if we look at popular culture, the continuities resonate. That, of course, is the image from Dr. Strangelove. Here is President Strangelove. And yet, when we pursue those continuities analytically, there is an extraordinary void. If you look at this staged conversation with Noam Chomsky on Western terrorism, from Hiroshima to drone warfare, What is remarkable about it is that it says virtually nothing about either Hiroshima or drone warfare. Those are the two bookends, but neither interlocutor seems to be prepared to take the book off the shelf. So what I've tried to do for this afternoon's presentation is to explore the ways in which those two seemingly incommensurable weapon systems have a genealogy which shows that they've been entangled almost from the very beginning. And I want to begin with perhaps the most striking point of all, and it's one to which I will return in inverted form at the end, which is to say that both of them speak to what Frederick Maigret calls the vanishing battlefield. He writes that the development of nuclear weapons has to a considerable degree helped blur the notion of the battlefield as a fixed, bounded space in which combatants meet and a clash of arms resonates. The attacks completely and metaphorically annihilated the battlefield by sending the message that no place was safe from war. The new weapons could, in one great big flash, abolish any distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Now, of course, that process began much, much earlier. It began with the First World War. It's air power that is most spectacularly responsible for the deconstruction of the battlefield. And yet, when Tom Vanderbilt also writes about a war with no clear boundaries, no clear battlefields, a war waged in such secrecy that both records and physical locations are often utterly obscured, he could also surely be writing about today's drone operations, particularly those carried out by the United States Air Force for the CIA. Now, others have claimed that through those programs of targeted killing, which have radicalized the deconstruction of the battlefield, we too face a global battlefield. Now, as it happens, I think in all sorts of ways they're wrong, and in all sorts of ways, those critics of drones level precisely the wrong criticisms against them. Their typical complaint concerns distance. But if, after all, you think it's wrong to kill somebody from 7,500 miles away, firstly, we need to understand that there are multiple weapon systems that can do that. Drones are simply one platform for delivering them. But more importantly, if you do think that, if you do think it wrong to kill somebody over 7,500 miles, I would be very interested to know over what distance you think it is acceptable to kill somebody. The real question, I think, is not about distance, but it's about safety and security. The fact of the matter is that if for the moment we bracket those cruise missiles stationed in Europe, if we bracket those prowling underneath the oceans on submarines, at the very beginning, the plan was, of course, to launch from the safety and security of the United States. And most of you will know that today's drone operations are flown from bases in the continental United States. Takeoffs and landings are handled by crews much closer to the theatre of operations, but the missions themselves are flown from the continental United States. And it's that question of security and safety which gives me the springboard into a really rather obvious point, that the safety in question is the safety of Americans. So, for example, when the Enola Gay flew on its mission over the blue skies of Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945 to drop that hideously named bomb, Little Boy, its major concern was not with the accuracy of the bomb. It was not about the bombing and the aiming. It was about the escape. The crew sought advice and was told that they needed to execute a 155-degree turn, and they practiced that even more than they practiced the bomb run itself in order to escape the shock effects from the blast. And it was the concern for the survival of air crews that prompted the United States Air Force to explore a whole imaginary about robot planes remotely controlled war. It established a pilotless aircraft branch, which very soon after the end of the Second World War began to experiment with flying B-17 bombers through radio controls from an accompanying so-called director aircraft. At crucial moments, particularly for takeoff and landing, control would beep back to a ground control station. But these bombers first saw their most effective operational use in those experiments in the Marshall Islands. So if we look at Operation Crossroads in July 1946, there was no secret about the tests, but there was no secret about the drones, as they were called. This is popular mechanics. B-17 drones, operating by remote control from mother planes, the director aircraft, will photo the test. And so they did. Here's a B-17 drone controlled by transmitters on the ground, landing during Operation Crossroads. And the official record, Bombs at Bikini, makes it plain that these were not simply advances in nuclear weapons. These were not even simply advances in the photography that Joe Masco talked about this morning. Operation Crossroads was the first operation in which takeoff, flight and landing were accompanied with no one on board. Now, they weren't alone. The US Navy, always keen to get on in the act, had its own drones, the Hellcat drones, which took off from the decks of aircraft carriers. They were radio controlled, but not surprisingly, the difficulties of landing on an aircraft carrier, even with an experienced crew on board, are sufficiently taxing that they too returned to land rather than to the carrier. And what were they about? They were firstly about photography. So many of the photographs that Joe showed this morning were, of course, up close or on the ground. But equally important, these drones were sent through the cloud, 8 minutes after Mike hour, and then 3 more at different heights in the following minutes to take these series of extraordinary photographs. They were also charged with taking air samples. So the official pictorial record, and the fact that there is an official pictorial record, tells you a great deal about the managed publicness that Joe was talking about. Drone planes, it says, penetrated where no man could have ventured, flew through the mushroom cloud on photographic missions, sampled its poisonous content, televised to remote onlookers their instrument panel readings for flight analysis. Meanwhile, the United States Air Force was experimenting with the real game changer, as it thought. It was one thing to use drones to monitor the effects of atomic weapons, but could you use them to deliver them? Because by this stage, the US Air Force was convinced that no aircraft would withstand the blast of bombs which were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So they embarked upon Project Brass Ring. Project Brass Ring intended to use a B-47 carrier with completely automatic operation from takeoff to bomb drop. The first test flight was indeed successful. The automatic takeoff, climb and cruise sequence was initiated remotely from a ground control station. But this was an expensive project, it was a highly uncertain project, and in March 1951 it was abandoned when the Air Force finally determined that a manned aircraft could execute the delivery safely, at least for those on board. And that conclusion was prompted in part by the recordings made by those drones during earlier test flights. Drones continued to be used to monitor and, crucially, to take those air samples in subsequent tests in the Marshall Islands, but also when tests transferred to the continental United States. And so here is an image of drones at Indian Springs. This was the portal into the Nevada proving grounds. And here you can see Air Force mechanics calibrating radio control equipment in a Lockheed QF-80 drone, described there as a pilotless aircraft. And this too was controlled both from the ground, but during the crucial stages of maneuver by a so-called director aircraft, which enabled what they called nullo operations, no live operator on board. So all of that, you see, was about saving American lives. I discover in the last 20 minutes that the US Army had no hesitation in sending young men right up close and dangerous, but the US Air Force clearly had a much more reserved view. And they concluded that it was possible, as I say, to deliver these weapons with no danger to the crews on board. And you can see that most clearly when Hollywood starts to celebrate in this film Strategic Air Command, issued in 1955. It starred James Stewart and June Allison. And nothing can celebrate American life more, surely, than American love, hence June Allison's critical co-starring role. This brings me to my third point, which is that it wasn't until 1994 that another company closely associated with the atomic age, General Atomics, proudly unveiled its first Predator drone. What's significant about the drone, of course, is that it starts out as a platform for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, radicalizing those early photographic missions. It has no director aircraft. It's controlled from a ground control station, but eventually, of course, it will be armed. But still, the object of the exercise is to save American lives, or as the Air Force prefers to put it, to project power without projecting vulnerability. And that question of vulnerability loomed large, as we know, during the very first atomic tests. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey kept finding its mind wandering from Hiroshima to Nagasaki back to the United States. What if the target for the bomb had been an American city? And so, as Paul Boyer puts it, physically untouched by the war, the United States at the moment of victory perceived itself as naked and vulnerable. Americans envisioned themselves not as a potential threat to other peoples, but as potential victims. And that imagery was reinforced for the American public. This is Life, the appropriately named Life magazine, on the 19th of November 1945, showing the 36-hour war with targets, in this case Washington, being attacked from the air, but multiple cities being attacked in the same series of strikes. Perhaps the most famous image of all from Collier's magazine, Hiroshima, USA. But what's remarkable about all these images, of course, is that they're views from the air, and those views from the air were turned into practical effect. As it happened, American cities did become targets, but for the US Air Force. Under General Curtis LeMay, for example, they staged mock attacks on every city in the United States, with a population larger than 25,000, practicing to drop atomic bombs on urban targets in the middle of the night. San Francisco was bombed more than 600 times within a month. And very rarely did bodies on the ground appear. When they did, they were mannequins, as in these images from the Nevada test site. Now, these went on tour around the United States, but the tagline is the crucial one. These mannequins could have been real people. In fact, they could have been you. So again, this constant access on the vulnerability of American bodies. And yet the photography of the so-called nuclear sublime, I've always liked Terry Eagleton's view of the sublime as that which reminds us of our dwarfish inability to know. The nuclear sublime offered this God's eye view, and crucially, a visual field in which bodies were conspicuously absent. And so Hiroshima before and after from the air. And the crucial point there was to remove and censor all photographs of bodies. Now, the question of bodies looms large, as a matter of fact, when we turn to the question of drones. Because it turns out, and as A.L. Weitzman has shown in compelling detail, any reconstruction of drone attacks, absent the release of the videos that make them possible, has to rely on satellite photography. And satellite photography is degraded, deliberately degraded, below the level at which a human body will appear. The bodies are hidden in the pixels. Interestingly, too, there have been very few attempts to show what would happen if drone attacks were directed against the United States, against American bodies. There are exceptions, like Omar Fast's 5,000 feet is best, or Thomas van Houtrevis' Blue Sky Days. But for the most part, the bodies are absent. And one of the ways in which they become absent is through the bureaucratic process through which a killing machine turns into the rational exercise of administration. When I talk about the administration of military violence, I mean that in the double sense of the term. Shortly after the Second World War, Henry Nash, who worked for the Air Targets Division in the US Department of Defense, recalled his time producing what was called the Bombing Encyclopedia of the World. This was produced by the Pentagon, and it was a catalogue listing all possible targets for future air attack, starting within the Soviet Union, but then spreading until finally it encompassed the world. And Nash, having worked on this for months and years, eventually realized what he was doing. But precisely because responsibility had been parceled out, precisely because this was turned into a rational bureaucratic process, even a scientific one, it took an extraordinarily long time for the penny to drop, even if it took rather less time for the bomb to drop. This was, he says, the bureaucratization of homicide. Now we know that standing at the apex of that process is the President of the United States, who alone can order and activate the nuclear football. Only the President of the United States can authorize the employment of US nuclear weapons. But we know too that there's a comparable bureaucratic process for targeted killing in Pakistan, in Yemen and Somalia, outside established war zones, and there too the President stands at the apex, and there is, thanks to the intercept here, a remarkably complicated bureaucratic process, which is also about abstraction. Abstraction doesn't simply take place visually, but it takes place functionally through this extended kill chain. But of course it depends not simply on forms shuffling from person to person, it depends upon so-called intelligence. And here too there are entanglements. This is a slide from the NSA asking, what resembles Little Boy? One of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan during World War II, and as Little Boy did, represents the dawn of a new era. If you answered, a pod mounted on an unmanned aerial vehicle that is currently flying missions in support of the global war on terrorism, you would be correct. Now, in fact, there are still more continuities, because it turns out that these early predators, when they were set spinning in the sky, were operating over Afghanistan. There were prototypes much earlier in Bosnia, for example, but the most successful versions were being flown over Afghanistan in the hunt for bin Laden. And it was eventually decided that if they were really going to take out bin Laden, the predator needed to be armed, otherwise you'd have to activate that whole bureaucratic chain, and by the time the decision had come back down, the target would have moved. But there was a problem. Operations over Afghanistan were made possible by a satellite link to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. And the US government was worried that a predator armed with a missile would violate the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, largely because that treaty defined missiles as unmanned, self-propelled weapon delivery systems, which, if you think about it, sounds an awful lot like a Predator or a Reaper. Now, the lawyers argued and argued and argued, the billable hours mounted up, until they eventually decided that it wouldn't contradict that treaty at all. But because of the Status of Forces agreement with Germany, Berlin would have to be told about the decision to arm the Predator. The Pentagon was sufficiently alarmed that they switched operations from Ramstein, from Europe, and moved them to the continental United States. So that the Predators are controlled by satellite, the satellite downlinks to Ramstein, and now there's a transatlantic fiber optic cable back to a ground control station at Creech Air Force Base. Creech Air Force Base used to be known as Indian Springs, where those drones were flying in support of tests at the Nevada test site. So as you can see, these histories are entangled in all sorts of ways. But let me come to my title, Little Boys and Blue Skies. Because it's really not about the blue skies of Hiroshima, and it's not about that hideously misnamed bomb. Soon after that hideously misnamed bomb fell on Hiroshima, to be followed, as we know, by another fat man over Nagasaki, President Truman broadcast to the nation, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base." That was because, I find it difficult to read this, we wished in this first instance to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. Now that was, in its entirety, a naked lie. Here is John Brennan talking about targeted killing. There hasn't been a single collateral death because of the exceptional proficiency, precision of the capabilities we've been able to develop. He means the predators and the reapers. And that, too, is a calculated, deliberate, and transparent lie. And yet, of course, a palpable difference remains. Think of the literally countless dead at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then think of the thousands that have been killed by predators and reapers in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. Surely, the scale of difference is palpable. But I want to suggest that the space of killing and the space of grieving is identical. Because in that moment, people are terrifyingly, dreadfully alone. This is a poem by a survivor of Hiroshima called Blue Sky of Hiroshima. And she describes going out with her father to search for the bodies of her mother and her brother. She talks about finding her mother's bone. "When I put it in my mouth, tasted lonely. Tasted lonely. The unbearable sorrow began to rise in my father and I, left alone, screaming and picking up bones and putting them into the candy box where they made a rustle. My little brother was right beside my mummy, little more than a skeleton. His insides, not burnt out completely, lay exposed." That's what I mean about the awful loneliness of killing. So let me now take you to North Waziristan and to a drone strike on the 24th of October 2012. A drone strike which, according to Amnesty International, killed a grandmother as she was in the fields picking okra, accompanied by two of her grandchildren. Her name was Mamana Bibi. After that attack, the surviving members of the family were flown to Washington to testify before members of Congress. 5 members of Congress showed up. That too is what I mean by the loneliness of killing. And during those hearings, her grandson, a little boy, said this: "I no longer love blue skies. In fact, I now prefer grey skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are grey. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question for Derek regarding the drone papers that were released recently by The Intercept. I want to know what you think the kind of impact of these revelations will be, both on your research and in kind of our broader understanding of drone warfare.
Thanks very much. Is this on? Yeah. There's a question about the drone papers. I haven't had a chance to work through them in great detail yet. What I can say is that there have been two reactions that I've detected so far. Those who are proponents of drones insist that this tells us nothing we didn't know already. And other commentators have argued that it tells us much more than we knew before. From what I've read so far, my own view is somewhere between the two. I think it tells us a considerable amount, as it happens, about the space over which drones operate and the sheer difficulty in fulfilling the promise of the manufacturers of the predators and the reapers. In other words, what they claim is persistent presence. General Atomic's slogan is dwell, detect, destroy. And the notion is that you can do all three from the same platform. But it turns out that that is compromised because of the limited operating range of the drone. So that there's been considerable difficulty in maintaining the unblinking eye over the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. I'm not surprised at that, because the fact of the matter is drones today have a remarkably short operating range. They can be controlled from the United States, but they have to land, take off and land close to the theatre of operations. They're also very slow and they're very sluggish. That's why the idea that this somehow turns the world into a global battlefield, I think, is much more complicated than most of the critics seem to realize. What we really need to know much more about, though, I think, is what's happening in Pakistan, and the drone papers are more or less completely silent about that. They do also usefully remind us that the major locus for targeted killing by the United States is none of those places. It's been Afghanistan.
Throughout the day, the thing that's been looming larger and larger, and was pinpointed when I spoke to Blake Fitzpatrick about the municipal response to what's going on in that city, is the issue of denial. And I realize this is an oblique question, but you've introduced me to a literature that I wasn't familiar with, Derek, and I appreciate it. Is there a parallel literature on the madness of denial that accompanies everything we've been hearing today?
It depends what you mean by literature, I suppose.
Research?
Oh, yes, there is. I mean, Matt can speak much more about, in fact, Matt can speak about atomic testing and nuclear war in ways that I simply can't. But one of the most interesting things I think about the use of the drone is that the United States Air Force says that it gives them the unprecedented ability to put warheads on foreheads. In other words, to target individuals. So whenever I talk about drones, people always say to me, but come on, you know, this isn't Dresden. This is not firebombing Hamburg or Cologne, as though that's the kind of moral standard we should be setting ourselves. But this capacity actually works its way out through a public discourse, which on the one hand celebrates surgical strikes, but secondly, removes bodies from the field of view. So we have these curious surgical operations which are taking place without a body. And that seems to me the locus of the most significant denial that takes place. It's what James Dederian calls virtuous war. But Matt, I'm sure, has much more to say about atomic war.
I think just in reading about what was happening at the test site, there were all sorts of obfuscations and just a lot of messy behavior which can then be used to hide behind in some ways. So for instance, some of the activities that were being conducted vis-a-vis the soldiers are described as purely occupational. It's very difficult to think about soldiers as exploited subjects of human radiation experiments when they are simply following orders. And so this whole question of, who is a volunteer for an experiment, for instance, is impossible in some ways to address, and that's been a real challenge for the atomic veterans. And the other thing seems to be sort of people literally not getting the memo that even when different kinds of orders are coming from the Pentagon, perhaps as a result of publicity or other sorts of pressures, that they don't seem to trickle down to the test site, or they don't trickle down for a very long time. And so things continue and continue and continue, and they seem to gather their own momentum even when it's very clear that they're not providing any useful evidence, whatever you'd call that. So.
Could I just add something to that? Because one of the differences when we move to drone operations, I think, is that the US media and beyond, and remember that Canada operates drones too. I mean, it leased them from Israel for its operations over Afghanistan, for example. One of the juiciest stories as far as the US media has been concerned is that, in a sense, drone pilots and sensor operators are exploited subjects because the drone relies on full motion video, and the latest iteration of that is high definition full motion video, which means that they can see in the most extraordinary detail what it is they've done. So that precisely unlike Cologne or Hamburg or Dresden, where you were bombing at night, or where you moved in fast and moved off fast, the drone is required to remain on station to carry out what they call a battle damage assessment. And so crews can see in the most extraordinary detail now what it is that they've done. So bodies appear in their field of view. But the story in the US press is precisely about the PTSD suffered by drone pilots and operators. And there's no discussion of the bodies that appear in the crosshairs or of the PTSD suffered by those who have to live under drones in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere.
Thanks, Derek. Just to follow up on from exactly that point, what appears in the imaginary kind of sinister is that real-time, detailed ability to evaluate the target and then confirm the kill. But I want to point out what might be a tiny omission, although it was alluded to in one of the slides, is the difference between that real-time drone warfare and what was very heavy in the imagination in the 1980s is of the cruise missile being a fully robotic drone that had a very different latency, where it was given instructions, and the cruise missile makes its own judgments. It chooses its own flight path. It can operate in gray skies. And I just wonder where, again, it is about trading off, different kinds of bads, but I just wonder if you have any comments about that. And again, the slide that suggested drones were a way around a treaty that likely was about the cruise missile. And yeah, any general comments there?
Yeah, the general one, to be very quick, is that, of course, cruise missiles have been used by the United States to carry out so-called targeted killing in Yemen. They've been launched from ships offshore. But it's quite clear that their preferred means of carrying out targeted killing, other than special forces on the ground, which have also been responsible for many more than ever appear in the public record, is the drone. But the point about the grey skies is that drones not only slow and very difficult to maneuver, which is why you can only use them against people who can't fight back. You can only use them in undefended airspace. You couldn't send a Predator or a Reaper over Russia or China because it would be shot down in a millisecond. So you can only use these over, as I say, people who can't fight back. But they're vulnerable to weather. So cloud, for example, has caused endless numbers of drones to crash in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. So, I mean, you're quite right about cruise missiles, but it's this ideology of putting warheads on foreheads, and it's this process of the individuation of war, which is, I think, a significantly new dimension of later modern war. It hasn't replaced all of the others, but it's sufficiently new, and that is, of course, radically different from... Oh, I see. Yeah. No, I think that's right, but I've nothing to add to that. I mean, the point about all of this, though, is that when you talk to the people who are involved in operating these kinds of systems, they all say that the one thing you don't have in war is time, and that problem has actually accelerated. So if you look at the detailed conduct of drone strikes in Afghanistan, which is what I have done, what you find is that there's so much information zipping around now at faster and faster speeds. These full motion videos are being distributed all over the place, that in fact, far from making it easier to know what's going on, it actually becomes much, much more difficult, because you've got these video feeds being seen in the continental United States, you've got them being seen at Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and you've got them being seen at command posts in Afghanistan. And there are simply too many people with eyes on what's happening, too many voices through the microphone. They're all seeing different things, interpreting the situation differently. So there's a different kind of latency there. And it's not necessarily a, quote, improvement over the cruise missile.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt and Derek, both. It's great talks. I was curious, and this might be casting a bit of a wide net, but something I was thinking of during both of your talks is kind of the role of landscape in both of these scenarios. And Derek, I know you've written something kind of recently about like landscapes and warfare and the jungle and the desert as stages of pure war and unknowability, respectively. But I'm curious too how the Arctic might play into this as an inhospitable location, but also the desert and Nevada as both kind of orientalized landscapes, but also landscapes of kind of pure war and flat space. That might be too broad, but I was just curious.
I mean, I know that some geographers dismiss that word or that concept a little bit. It's a bit old-fashioned. I love it simply just because of the combination of materiality and imagination that goes into making a landscape. But, you know, one of the reasons I started all this was because I discovered some, a rather modest little agency that the Air Force created in the Second World War called the Arctic Desert Tropic Information Center. And it was essentially created, and it lasted right through the 50s as well, and sort of took on different projects. It was very interested in questions of survival, which is a whole other issue, but, you know, created to kind of understand the landscapes in which the Air Force in this case, but the military more generally, found itself during the 1940s and 50s. And of course, this required not just the sort of direct study of these places as they actually existed on the ground, but the recreation of those places in all sorts manner of formal and informal simulations and other kinds of imaginative discussions. And so there's a way in which a kind of very active global form of military geography is being produced during this period that does span these different kinds of landscapes, and it requires an understanding of the Arctic or the desert as a very sort of homogeneous entity, a place that requires significant skill in the soldier who is kind of inculcated or indoctrinated into setting foot in these spaces in order to both survive, but also, of course, to defeat both natural and cultural foes at the same time. And I think that combination of nature and culture is so powerful.
The only other quick thing to add, since you mentioned Orientalism, is that in both cases, quite clearly the targets are orientalized. So if you look at Michael Sherry's The Rise of Armageddon, he talks about the way in which the use of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki was rationalized and indeed prepared for long in advance by the racialization of the Japanese as not only being not people like us, but not really people at all. And you find exactly the same argument being used in Pakistan, in Yemen, and Somalia, and elsewhere. So that is a dismally common trope to both.
I have another question for Derek, and I guess I'd be curious to, for you. I'd just like to hear more about how you understand the particular value of continuity in this case. So, say not Joseph Masco's presentation notwithstanding, perhaps like what is it that you understand as particularly urgent in actually forging a certain understanding of continuity rather than the emergence of something new or different?
The two dodgy answers are to say that this is highly preliminary, and that secondly, this is what I was asked to do. But there is a more thoughtful answer, and the more thoughtful answer is this, that there's been a great deal of work exploring the genealogy of drone warfare today. And much of that goes back to the wars over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Some of it goes back to Vietnam and the use of drones over North Vietnam for reconnaissance. And some goes back even further to experiments round about the time of the First World War. Now, as it happens, I think that long genealogy is important because what it reveals is precisely that gavotte between secrecy and transparency that Joe was talking about. In other words, that which is exposed to the public is exposed deliberately and knowingly. And in those different settings, essentially a public is being told, you may see this. But what is not being told is that you may see this on condition that you don't see that. And what emerges through that genealogy, I think, is two crucial dimensions which are relevant to connecting nuclear war to drone warfare, for all the differences between them. And one is the very obvious attempt to render military violence as a scientific technical achievement, so that it's about inducing a sense of awe, not simply as Rumsfeld intended amongst the subject target population of Baghdad, but within, in this case, the American public. And that sense of spectacle actually starts at the very beginning. So 2 or 3 years before the First World War, a theatre in London was filled night after night by a man who had a remote-controlled airship. And every single night, this airship would float out over the audience. And then when he moved a lever on the stage, paper birds would fall from the airship. And he told his audiences night after night after night that in the real world, they could be bombs. And he could sit at his desk in London and drop bombs on, and the list is really quite bizarre, Manchester, Paris, or Berlin. Now, the inclusion of Manchester is interesting because, of course, that immediately raises all sorts of questions about navigation and intelligence and your ability to know where you are in the world at any one time. But you can see that's a spectacle which is being arranged for a public audience. So I think that genealogy is important because I think it's a mistake to assume that this gavotte between secrecy and transparency is somehow unique to the post Second World War period. The other quick thing I would say is that throughout that genealogy of drones, I've seen no discussion anywhere of the way in which drones were instrumental in the ways that I tried to sketch out here. It came as a surprise to me.
Could I just add, I mean, I think geographers in general, and it's not entirely true in other disciplines, but we essentially, with certain prominent exceptions, we essentially discovered the United States military, at least those working in a rather critical bent, discovered the United States military after 9/11. I mean, there was very, very little scholarship on the subject on this tremendously powerful institution with this long genealogy that Derek describes. And I mean, I think it goes back to Joe's point about the relationships back to the nuclear state, to the military-industrial complex, however you wish to describe it. But those deep connections are so significant in this kind of rush to consider the latest and greatest. We ought not to forget that, especially when I think about the embeddedness of some of these institutions, some of these laboratories, some of these proving grounds that have been there for decades and decades and decades, reconfigured, renamed, expanded, not very often reduced, but still there.
Unfortunately, I have the mic. Hello. Thank you. I want to ask another question in the way of distance. The satellites that feed the GPS systems, that feed the navigation of the drones, where there's another battle going on that we do not see. And there's tests that go on in the way of the distances the satellites can carry images back and forth, as well as to how long and how far they can rotate and at what speed and all that other stuff. Can you please comment on what you know in the battle up there, please, and thank you.
Actually, can I answer a different question? Well, I want to answer the different question because there's a great deal of discussion out there about the role of satellite imagery and the part that it plays in modern war. But if you're going to operate a drone, that actually isn't the crucial thing at all. It doesn't matter. The crucial thing is satellite communications. And satellite communications are vital, even with that fiber optic cable under the Atlantic. And they're important in two ways. They're important, firstly, because the demands for bandwidth, as the number of combat air patrols goes up, a combat air patrol is basically 4 drones. Because if you're going to have persistent presence over any one location, you need 4 drones to guarantee that, because they're so slow. You've got to have 1 traveling there, you've got 1 on station, you've got 1 returning, and the 4th is always out for maintenance. But even so, as the number of combat air patrols has gone up to, I think, 65 currently, or some number like that, together with all the other drones and all the other demands for imagery that's being generated within the US military, the pressure on bandwidth is so great that it can only be fulfilled by commercial satellites. There are not enough military satellites to fulfill those demands. And even then, you can only transmit those images if they're degraded. If you actually transmit them with the full fidelity that the manufacturers promise, then the whole system collapses. So the quality of imagery which arrives at different sites is radically different depending on where you are, and all kinds of technologies are required to reconstitute them. So it's not the case that it's giving you this pristine imagery, either to fly the thing or for analysts to look at. And the second quick thing to say, therefore, is that Obama's pivot to the Pacific turns out to be a peculiarly difficult vow to fulfill, because the satellites that it uses presently for its operations in the so-called Greater Middle East, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, the commercial deals are all in place. But who do you think owns most of the satellites orbiting the Pacific? The answer is China.